Right, I'm going to talk about the case of Lucia de Berk and occasionally draw attention to, more than occasionally draw attention to connections with the case of Lucy Letby, similarities and differences, and of course hope to provoke you to see more. So let's start with, let's start with a timeline of the Lucia de Berk case. This is a bit much in one trial, perhaps. Things came to a head with the death of a baby at the Juliana Children's Hospital in The Hague in September 2001, September the 4th. And a nurse was immediately taken off hospital duty. Police were called in very rapidly indeed. Police investigation started and led to Lucia de Berk's arrest in December 2001. And pretty fast, soon after, the trial started at a lower court, at which Lucia was charged with a large number of murders and attempted murders of patients at her hospital, Juliana Children's Hospital, but also at other hospitals where she'd worked in the past, at 3 other hospitals where she'd worked in the past. And this resulted in convictions for murder and for attempted murder. I forget the exact numbers. The main evidence at this trial was statistical evidence, and not just the spreadsheet, for instance, but actually a statistical probability calculation. And a statistician announced that the probability that Lucia would have been at so many bad events as the actual numbers by chance was 1 in 342 million. That announcement had an enormous impact on everybody. Still, it was controversial to send somebody to jail for life on the basis of probability calculation. Of course, in forensic DNA, it's not so common at all. But anyway, quite soon there was a retrial at a higher court, as an appeal court. Both the defense and prosecution appealed. And this time, the statistical probability calculation was totally removed, was not considered part of the evidence at all, and somehow replaced by some irrefutable medical scientific evidence, which apparently had not been available first time round, together with a chain argument. And basically the idea was that one murder was proven scientifically by toxicology result, and Lucia's motive and Lucia's opportunity. The next case, basically working backwards in time, was established with less evidence, because now we already know that Lucia is a killer and a liar, because she denies having killed that child. And as you go down the chain, the evidence does not need to be so strong. It becomes successively weaker. And at some point, the court decided this was as far as we could go, even though they suspected she had killed or attacked many other patients. There was an application to the Supreme Court, and some evidence seemed to have got lost, but this didn't make any difference, according to the Supreme Court. And an odd thing happened, which I won't talk about now, the curious story. But anyway, in 2005, Lucia de Berk was definitively in jail for life. And everybody, many people believed indeed she was a very, very evil killer, serial killer. But at the same time, some whistleblowers started getting attention. And as the years went by, they got more and more attention, and more people started making noise. And also at the same time, people were working towards an application to the Dutch version of the CCRC. Well, and that happened, and it led finally in 2010 to complete exoneration of Lucia de Berk at a new court, at a new appeal court. And now the case is well known to have been the biggest miscarriage of justice in the Netherlands for a long, long time. And moreover, the judicial system and police, criminal prosecution in general, has learned a great deal from it, and a number of reforms have taken place. So let's look more closely at Lucia for just briefly. Then I will go into Lucy Letby a bit, and then I will come back to Lucia. So things started off at the medium care unit 1 of the Juliana Children's Hospital in The Hague. And Lucia had been working there from October 2000 through to September 2001. So that's a year, more or less. And the questions one can and should ask, was there indeed a spike in the number of deaths at a unit where deaths are sadly not terribly rare? I mean, the answer is yes, there was a spike. But the next question is, well, should that spike have been expected? Could that spike have had an innocent explanation? That's the question which should have been asked at that time. Was there next, of course, again, is there an innocent explanation for the obvious association between a particular nurse's presence and suspicious incidents? And the association was obvious from the numbers we saw. You can call them statistics if you want to, whether or not a statistician was involved, whether or not any probability was calculated. Are deaths or other incidents really so hard to explain as appears? Well, this is the main data at the first trial. I mean, the main evidence at the first trial. And all parts are important. The first part, the top part, is the last year at the Juliana Children's Hospital, where you see that there had been a total of 9 incidents throughout the year, and every single one of them had happened in Lucia's shifts. And one may wonder, what is the definition of an incident? Well, a number of the incidents were deaths. They were obviously, perhaps I should say, suspicious incidents. They were incidents which were hard to explain medically, perhaps. And you see that Lucia works about 1/6 of all the shifts, 1,000 shifts in a year, 3 shifts a day, each of 8 hours. And that's what you should expect, the 1/6, roughly. And you see the same at the earlier hospital, Red Cross Hospital, Ward 42, 4 months in 1997. Again, Lucia was on duty during about 1/6 of the shifts during those months. There were 15 incidents, and only 6 occurred. 6 occurred. That's, getting on for half, isn't it? Getting on for half in her shifts, whereas she only works 1/3 of all the shifts. That's a striking imbalance there in that table, a correlation. And the last one is, in many ways, the most striking and interesting. There were 5 incidents, so I suppose this means events which are hard to explain, and But Lucia herself only worked one shift during those 4 months. Look, it's the same. It's the same 4 months. It's the same hospital. It's just the next door ward. One day she worked on ward 41, and then there was death, a suspicious death. And it's a very suspicious death because it's the death of a very elderly, terminally ill judge, a judge on the International Court of Justice in The Hague, formerly on the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And the day that that happened, she wrote one of her sinister writings in her diary that she had done something really bad that day, which she was very ashamed of. Let's go over to Lucy Letby now, and like those are the things which one could wonder about. As a statistician, of course, I'm ignoring medical evidence here because I'm focusing on the statistics of statisticians. So there you see the spike. There was a spike. It's pretty clear something is going on there, which certainly merits investigation. And the fact is, the matter is, it has a very good explanation, a very good innocent explanation. So let me let me show you some statistics, a statistical analysis done fairly recently by Peter Elston using publicly NHS public data of many hospitals, including counters of chest and neonatal mortality. And what you see there is that in the 2 years, the spike, the number of deaths is basically what you would have expected to have been, certainly within statistical variation of what you would have expected. And here are two calculations, two very simple calculations based on basic statistics on two factors, but not combining them because we don't know the intersection, as it were. We don't know if there's an interaction effect, and probably that is. But if you look at birth weight alone, or if you look at gestational age alone of the babies being cared for, then that actual number of deaths is not really different from what you would have expected. So this leads to, maybe I should have postponed this or not told you at all, but my current personal explanation, based on a lot of things that I know, is that this is the explanation. This is, in some ways, the explanation of the whole thing. Countess of Chester Hospital had ambitions to grow. It had big ambitions, and especially in childcare. Well, in maternity care, and therefore also in neonatal care. It wanted to become a regional hospital and not just a town hospital, you could say, a local hospital. And it was supposed to experiment according to NHS policy. Hospitals are supposed to compete for resources, survival of the fittest, which is bad news for the unfit. But it means that there has to be room for innovation and ambition for hospitals to branch out, to diversify, or to deepen the care they are giving in the chosen areas of future excellence, let us say. But of course, at the same time, since the 90s, resources have been shrinking. And we know that the shrinking resources were acting very severely in Chester, especially in the neonatal intensive care unit. It was nominally level 2, but actually it was staffed and equipped as level 1, and it was really badly staffed, shortly staffed, really under-equipped, and of course a pretty grotty place altogether, as we now know, despite the efforts of the nurses and the doctors, I suppose, too, attempts to give good care, but they were not succeeding in giving good care. Now, increased admission of level 2 and level 3 babies, which is exactly what was going on. That's why those numbers went up, why the expected numbers went up, certainly. It increases hospital income because the NHS funding depends on numbers of patients of different categories. And of course, increased acuity and increased activity increases number of deaths. And it probably did. I mean, I think it certainly did. But what this also tells me is that the leadership at Countess of Chester, and especially in particular the clinical leadership, should have and could have expected that spike. So the notion that that spike is suspicious, well, the notion that it's unexpected is absolutely wrong, and the notion that it's suspicious is wrong too. But it's a notion which has been promoted, and that's a bad thing. Now, let's have a quick look at, well, a very quick look at the spreadsheet, which is, of course, that is statistics. Please call it a statistical analysis, even if some observers say that, but there's no statistics there. Yeah, well, yes, there are. That's a statistical summary of visual, graphical summary of data, and it's important to know how the data was gathered and who classified events and how and why as suspicious. When I prefer to look at it this way, I simply order the nurses by their first event at which they are present in this spreadsheet. Of course, I'm not talking about the fact that many events are missing, and of course, much personnel who's also on the unit is missing. There's already the Texas sharpshooter in narrowing attention to just these nurses and in showing only these events. It's a lie, a damned lie, or a statistic. But what you can see when you look at it this way, I think much more clearly, is that the pattern of X's outside of Lucy Letby's terrible violet column is not random at all. There are nurses who work on the unit for a short time period or for a couple of short time periods. There is a correlation in time. There is obviously the correlation of the twins and the triplets, which you see even more clearly here. The neighboring, the adjacent columns of XXX's correspond to twins and triplets especially. There are the questions again. Let's get back to Lucia, and let's talk. I'd like to quickly go through various phases of such a story as the story of Lucia, and the story as far as it has been told so far of Lucy Letby. Suspicion emerges in a hospital. That happens before any real investigations, whether internal or external. Doctors and nurses are worried by a spike in deaths, and they're also worried about a particular nurse. There's gossip about the nurse. They are associating them. The nurse is even worried and sees the association, feels the association. Worried doctors start compiling dossiers and making lists and building spreadsheets concerning and counting events, suspicious events, when the suspicious nurse is present. They are suspicious. At the Juliana Children's Hospital, it's clear that the senior pediatrician at the hospital, and that's a very important person because it's a children's hospital, so she's and in fact, one of the most important pediatricians in the country, you could say, certainly very well known pediatrician in the world of pediatricians in the Netherlands. She was basically waiting for Lucia to strike again. She had earlier alerted management. Together they were watching Lucia, waiting for one more bad event, and then they would going to act. And it happened. Baby Amber died unexpectedly. She was supposed to be going home. Actually, she was supposed to be going home to die at home, but she was supposed to be going home soon. She'd just had a successful heart operation, one of very many operations she'd had in her short 6 months life so far. Management called in the police. Medical dossiers of 9 events given to the police. The director of the hospital immediately got on the phone to fellow directors at other hospitals where Lucia had worked recently. The 2x2 table, which I showed you already, I can't remember. Yes, I showed it to you already. The 2x2 table was, as it were, completed, and probability calculation was made. The police start investigating. At first, they're not convinced, but a new police inspector, chief police inspector leading the investigation, does become convinced when he talks to a statistician who had recently helped a similar case and who later became the chief prosecution witness. It went on from there. The chief pediatrician at the Juliana Children's Hospital basically coached the police investigation, certainly as far as it was at her hospital. And no doubt she used her network to help police find other experts and so on and so forth. I'll skip this slide. There are interesting differences between the judicial systems. Let's leave that for the moment. Partly important differences, partly unimportant. I wanted to talk about the role of social networks again, which is, I think, also important in the Lucy Letby case, the connections which people had. And I'm not inventing conspiracies here. I'm not saying there were conspiracies, but I'm saying that people know each other, and people get their friends to help, and people's interests align, and people start collaborating in first instance in solving what seems like something terrible has happened, and something has to be done about it. Has to be done fast and effectively. People reinforce one another's suspicions, and things grow, and it's a bit like a witch hunt. It's not a real conspiracy, but there are people collaborating from different spheres of interest, spheres of society. In the Lucia de Berk case, many important figures were fellow musicians in an amateur orchestra. And you can look in the program booklets of that orchestra, which gave a public conference once or twice a year, and the participants are listed, and you will find famous persons from the trial, from prosecution, and from the world of medicine, and from journalism. You will find such persons next to one another in the list. In the same lists of participants of a number of concerts. And actually later, of course, the same social connections or other parts of the same networks worked. I have got these booklets in my possession because of other social connections going from the amateur orchestra through academia to myself, through a mathematics professor, actually. At one of those concerts, the public prosecutor was heard to say to the chief pediatrician, "Don't worry, child, we are going to burn the witch." And the person who caused these booklets to end in my possession was so shocked and appalled by that. But of course, those people were comforting their friend and sharing, were commiserating in the terrible situation she was in, being the top medical person at a hospital where there'd been a serial killer, and some of her own patients had been killed by her personal own patients had been killed by that nurse. An amusing and I think actually significant correlation between the two cases are the three smoking guns. Sinister writings in a diary, the statistics, call it statistics or not, but the numbers of suspicious incidents in the particular nurse's shifts, and strong evidence, scientific evidence that one baby had been murdered or attacked. And of course, in both cases, there is a host of circumstantial evidence, and much of it is somewhat similar. So the judges of Lucia de Berk ended up convicting her using only indisputable scientific evidence and the chain argument, and they did not use statistics at all, and they were proud of it. I mean, they emphasized it, that they were not using statistics. But if you look at the testimony of medical experts, they used the fact that, as anybody could see, it couldn't be a coincidence. This was the reason which led two medical experts to conclude that event X and another one, event Y, were not natural events, but were suspicious events, were probably, in fact, attacks. And of course, it would have to be by Lucia then. Statistical thinking sorry, I'd say it a different way. The judge's reasoning, 150 pages or something, going into all the details, is actually drenched with statistical reasoning without using the word statistics. The coincidence was obvious to everyone. I mean, the fact that the coincidence was impossible. Lucia couldn't explain it. It had to be explained. It couldn't be explained because Lucia herself said she didn't have more difficult shifts. And Lucia herself said that she was a good nurse, not a bad nurse. So that argumentation was present in the original statistician's report to the court, and it still permeates the arguments of the judges at the final conviction. There was the data again, and I'm not sure we need to talk about it anymore. I had it there because I wanted to emphasize that it was so important during the campaigning to get a retrial, whether you thought it was an unsafe conviction or whether you thought it was actually an innocent nurse who had been convicted. It doesn't make any difference, actually, at that stage. The 1 in 342 million was ringing in everybody's ears, and it was important to find out how the statistician had come to that number, and what maybe, and the best way to fight it was to give an alternative number. And it turned out that there were 3 really major errors in the number he gave. There was a really, beginner's blunder, combining 3 p-values, which would have reduced the number of zeros by 3. It would have gone back from millions to thousands. But there were also events missing. There were events which were identical to events where Lucia was supposed to have attacked a baby or a child or an adult at one of the other hospitals, but which were identical to, there were such events with her present and there were such events without her present. But essentially the same event. For instance, the same child having repeated collapses. Sometimes Lucia is there and sometimes she's not there. And if she's there, she caused it. And if she didn't, it's not in the table. There was no accounting for the hidden confounders, and it's not even for the known confounders. known but not measured, I could say, right? Day and night, summer and winter, you name it, different nurses, heterogeneity between nurses, everything you can think of. None of it was taken account of. And anyway, taking account of all three things in some way or another, I came to 1 in 50. And that had an impact on journalists and on the public. A campaign to get a retrial via the CEAS, Dutch CCRC, had actually two prongs, you could say. There was a very serious, careful, academic, objective, scientific group led by Tom Derksen going to the CEAS and being very careful and comprehensive and arguing about the complete judgment. I mean, going through the whole motivation and showing again and again and again, pointing out the errors and correcting them, and that led to the CEAS to reopen the case, but it also probably helped that there had been journalists interesting all kinds of things going on, a website, a supporters website, a demonstration, a petition, basically arguing that Lucy was most likely to be innocent. And that side is important because it was investigative journalists and amateur sleuths who found some of the most important things. And for instance, journalists uncovered the true cause of the spike. The hospital policy had been changed. The director of the hospital had essentially lied when he said that we never had so many deaths on this unit, because he had changed the name of the unit. That's why he could say that truthfully. Let's continue. Well, the usual things there. But of course, there was a lot of opposition from all levels of society, lots of opposition, and slowly shifting, of course. And I would say the public was convinced first, and then, well, the statisticians were convinced fast. The public was convinced next. The next steps went more slowly. Slowly, also, the medical world was convinced, and then finally the legal world was sort of forced to cooperate, I would say. It's all they did, really. They nicely cooperated, or maybe there was some luck. Social networks were useful, and social networks were crucial, yet again. And all the time, there was a serious problem to reopening the case. There's not going to be new evidence in a case like this, and there's not even going to be there may be new science, but it will be supporting the same scientific opinions as has previously been uttered and discounted by the lawyers. So it was absolutely critical to basically convince the world that this was a miscarriage of justice, and that did make all the difference, I believe, to how things went after that. After the CCRC, things went relatively, and including the membership of the committee, the inquiry committee of the CCRC, that things kind of went our way, but it could have been luck. So that's just saying the same things there. It did help that one of the former key scientific experts, they didn't change their mind, but they said that the new scientist had much more information available than he had, and therefore though he did not withdraw his previous testimony, he agreed with he fully supported the new toxicologist's findings. So, well, this is known. The Lucia de Berk case is the biggest miscarriage of justice the Netherlands had known for a long time, and led to many changes in the criminal prosecution. In my personal opinion, the Lucy Letby case is going to eventually be widely agreed to be an even bigger miscarriage of justice, and certainly also the biggest in the UK for many years. And I'm afraid it's going to take a terribly long time, and I really somewhere doubt she will survive more than a few years. Not because of that, but for various other reasons. I would like to make a plea to the president of the Royal Statistical Society and the executive board to publicly support the call for a royal commission. This can be done much faster than the CCRC, and it can be done, as it were, in private, in semi-private, and I think that's the way to go. And I write some remarks here about why. Okay, so that is the end of this presentation, and I hope it took a reasonable length of time. Stop